There is a list. You have probably seen it. Ya, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, and on it goes. A tidy column of names marching down the page like train stops. One empire handing power to the next in a clean, unbroken line. It is the way Chinese history is almost always taught. It is also, in a quiet way, a fiction. Not a lie. A simplification so old that it has hardened into truth. Because for huge stretches of those 4,000 years, there was no single dynasty ruling China at all. There were two, sometimes five. Sometimes a dozen warlords carving the map into pieces and each one insisting he was the real one. The neat list you have seen was written backwards by later historians who needed the chaos to make sense, who chose, after the fact, which of the warring claimants would be remembered as the dynasty and which would be filed under rebellion. So before we walk through every dynasty in Chinese history, one by one, the honest place to begin is with the strangest thing about the list itself. It was built to hide how messy the real story was. Start with the word because the English one is doing a lot of hidden work. A dynasty was not a country. It was a family. The Chinese term, Chao Dai, points at a ruling house, the bloodline sitting on the throne, not at a fixed nation with fixed borders. When the family changed, the dynasty changed. Even if the farmers in the fields, the language they spoke, and the bureaucrats collecting their taxes stayed exactly the same. This is the first thing to unlearn. The dynasties are a way of counting rulers, not a way of counting China's. So how did a family earn the right to be the ruling house? Here is where the most famous idea in Chinese political thought comes in. The mandate of heaven. The idea is simple and it is brutal. Heaven, not a personal god but a kind of cosmic moral order, grants one family the right to rule. Rule well, govern justly, keep the people fed, and the mandate stays. Rule badly, let corruption rot the court, let the harvests fail and the rivers flood, and heaven withdraws its blessing. The family falls. A new one rises to claim what heaven has handed down. The earliest surviving references to the concept come from Zhou-era texts, written after the Zhou had overthrown the Shang, which suggests something about what the idea was really for. Whether the Zhou invented it whole or formalized something older, the timing is hard to ignore. The doctrine that justified their conquest appears in the records right after the conquest itself. It was a tool. It turned rebellion into righteousness. Win, and you didn't seize the throne. You received it. Out of that single idea grew the theory that organizes nearly every textbook, the dynastic cycle. A strong founder takes the mandate. The dynasty flourishes. The population grows, the treasury fills, the arts bloom. Then, slowly, the rot. Lazy heirs, greedy officials, heavier taxes on poorer farmers, a famine, a flood, a rebellion. The mandate slips away, the dynasty collapses, and a new strong founder steps out of the wreckage to start the whole wheel turning again. It is an elegant theory. It is also, many historians now argue, a trap. The American sinologist John King Fairbank put it bluntly. He wrote that the concept of the dynastic cycle has been a major block to the understanding of the fundamental dynamics of Chinese history. His point was sharp. If you believe history is just the same wheel spinning over and over, rise, rot, fall, repeat, then you stop looking for the things that actually changed. The new crops, the new technologies, the slow shifts in trade, population, and money that don't fit neatly inside any one family's reign. The cycle implies there was little basic development or change in social or economic structures, when in fact the China of the year 1000 was a different planet from the China of the year 200. So keep both things in your head as we go. The cycle is real enough as a story the Chinese told about themselves. It is also a story that flattens an enormous amount of genuine, world-changing transformation. One more piece of groundwork: the dates. You will hear confident-sounding years for all of this, and you should hold the early ones loosely. For the first dynasties, our written sources were composed centuries, sometimes well over 1,000 years, after the events they describe. The numbers are best guesses stitched from later texts and modern archaeology. As the centuries roll forward and records improve, the dates sharpen. By the end, we know the exact night the last emperor's world ended. But at the beginning, we are reading shadows. Keep that in mind because the very first dynasty on the list is the one historians still argue about most. Here is the question that has occupied Chinese archaeologists for the better part of a century. Did the first dynasty exist at all? The Xia. Traditionally dated to roughly 2070 to 1600 BCE. The texts are confident about it. The records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian, clearly lists 17 Xia kings, from Yu the Great down to the tyrant Ji, and the story of Yu taming the Great Floods is one of the most beloved in all of Chinese myth. There is just one problem, and it is a large one. Sima Qian compiled that record around 1500 years after the Xia supposedly fell. To put that gap in perspective, it is as if our most detailed surviving account of the early Roman kings were being written today, from scratch, with no continuous documentary tradition in between. So scholars went looking for the Xia in the ground. In 1959, a researcher named Xu Xusheng led a survey team into western Henan province, hunting for what historical texts called the ruins of Xia. In Erlitu village, near Yanxi, they came upon a scatter of ancient pottery. Sherds, locals had turned up while digging a fish pond. What that dig eventually uncovered was a genuine Bronze Age city. Palace foundations, bronze workshops, evidence of a stratified society with rulers and ruled. The dating fit. The location fit. After more than 60 years of excavation, the prevailing view among Chinese scholars is that Erlitu was most likely the capital of the late Xia period. And here is the catch that keeps the argument alive. Erlitu has produced no writing. One of the central points used to challenge the Xia's historicity is the absence of any Xia script. No inscription anywhere that says, in effect, this is Xia. This is where Chinese and overseas scholars split. Chinese archaeologists generally accept that Erlitu represents the Xia capital, leaning on the later texts to confirm it. Critics outside China argue that archaeological data alone cannot confirm a dynastic identity. That finding a city is not the same as finding a named dynasty. The skeptic's case is straightforward. Without writing, no number of beautiful bronzes can prove the city's rulers called themselves Xia. That tension, between the texts that name names and the dirt that stays silent, is the single most important unresolved debate in early Chinese history. Hold on to it. We'll come back to why it matters more than it might seem. The second dynasty is on firmer ground, because the second dynasty wrote things down, and not on anything so fragile as bamboo. The Shang, roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE, left us their words burned into bone. They were called oracle bones. A Shang king wanting to know the future. Would the harvest hold? Would the queen's childbirth go well? Should he go to war? Would have a question carved into a turtle shell or an ox shoulder blade. The bone was heated until it cracked. A diviner read the cracks. And then, astonishingly, the question and sometimes the answer were inscribed right onto the bone, where they sat in the ground for 3,000 years until farmers near Anyang started grinding them up as medicine. Those inscriptions are the oldest substantial body of Chinese writing we possess, and the characters on them are direct ancestors of the ones used today. The Shang were real, they were literate, and they were ruthless. Their royal tombs are packed with the bones of human sacrifices. Then came the Zhou. And the Zhou matter more than their fame suggests, because the Zhou are where the operating system of Chinese statecraft was written. When the Zhou overthrew the Shang around 1046 BCE, they had a public relations problem. They were a frontier people toppling a long-established royal house. So they made an argument, the mandate of heaven we met earlier. The Shang king had become a monster, they said. Heaven had revoked his right to rule and handed it to the virtuous Zhou. It worked so well it never stopped working. Every dynasty for the next 3,000 years would reach for the same justification. The Zhou also hold a record nobody has broken, the longest ruling dynasty in Chinese history, nearly 800 years on paper. But that number hides the truth, and the truth is the theme of this whole video. For the first stretch, the Western Zhou, the kings genuinely ruled. Then, in 771 BCE, The capital fell to invaders. The court fled east, and the eastern Zhou kings became kings in name only. Sacred figureheads presiding over a land that had shattered into dozens of squabbling states. Historians don't even call most of that period by the dynasty's name. They call it the Spring and Autumn period, and then the Warring States period. The dynasty lasted 8 centuries. It actually governed for maybe a quarter of that. The rest was the list lying to keep things tidy. That long collapse was bloody. It was also, paradoxically, the most creative age in Chinese intellectual history. With no central authority, rival states competed for any edge, and thinkers wandered from court to court selling ideas. Confucius, Laozi, the strategists, the legalists, the moralists. We call it the 100 schools of thought, and almost every philosophy that would shape East Asia for the next 2 millennia was born in the wreckage of the Zhou. Chaos, it turns out, can be fertile. But the warring states could not last forever. Someone was going to win, and the someone who won would do something no one had ever done. In 221 BCE, the western state of Qin finished swallowing its rivals. Its king took a brand new title because king was no longer big enough. He called himself Huangdi, emperor, first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He ruled for 11 years. In 11 years, he changed everything. He abolished the old aristocratic fiefs and carved the empire into administrative districts run by appointed officials who reported to him. He standardized the script, so a document written in the far south could be read in the far north. He standardized weights, measures, and the width of cart axles, so the ruts in every road would fit every wagon. He linked older defensive walls into a single northern barrier, the distant ancestor of the Great Wall. He buried an army of thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers to guard him in death, and we only found them in 1974 when farmers digging a well struck a clay face staring back at them. He also burned books and, by some accounts, buried scholars alive to crush dissent. He was a tyrant. He was also the man who turned a collection of warring kingdoms into a single empire, and he gave it something that would outlast him by 2,000 years, the idea of unity. The idea that China was properly one thing. The name itself may carry him still. The word China, used across most of the world, is widely thought to descend through ancient Sanskrit and Persian from the name of his state, Qin, pronounced Chin. The etymology isn't settled. A few scholars have argued for other origins, but the Qin connection remains the most widely accepted theory. The empire that he built to last 10,000 generations did not survive his son. But his name, maybe, survived everyone. Because here is the turn. The Qin fell almost immediately. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. His heir was weak, the harsh laws that had built the empire now strangled it, and within 4 years of his death the dynasty was gone. The first all-China empire lasted barely 15 years. What rose from its ashes is the dynasty that gave the Chinese people the name most of them still use for themselves, the Han. Founded in 202 BCE by a man of peasant origins, the Han kept Qin's machinery, the centralized bureaucracy, the unified empire, but softened the brutal edges and dressed the whole thing in the robes of Confucian morality. It worked. The Han ruled, with one dramatic interruption for roughly 4 centuries, an arc as long as the entire Roman Empire's western half. Under the Han, Chinese armies pushed deep into Central Asia, and a thread of trade routes stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. We call those routes the Silk Road, and along them flowed not just silk but ideas, religions, and eventually disease. It was also under the Han that someone refined one of the most consequential objects in human history: paper. A court eunuch named Kai Lun is traditionally credited with perfecting the process around the year 105 CE, pulping mulberry bark, rags, and old fishing nets into thin sheets, cheap enough to spread literacy across an empire. Earlier paper fragments do exist, predating Kai Lun. So the honest reading is that he didn't invent the material from nothing. He turned a marginal craft into a scalable technology that the imperial court adopted. Bamboo strips were heavy. Silk was expensive. Paper was neither. It is hard to think of a single material that did more to shape the next 2,000 years, and it came out of a Han workshop. The dynasty that named a people also quietly gave the world the page. The Han governed through an idea as much as an army. The emperor was the son of heaven, the cosmic hinge between the human and the divine, and his officials were meant to be scholars steeped in the Confucian classics. That fusion, central power justified by moral philosophy and staffed by educated administrators, became the template every later dynasty would copy, argue with, and ultimately return to. The interruption is worth a sentence because it proves the point about the lying list. In 9 CE, an official named Wang Mong seized the throne and declared an entirely new dynasty, the Qin. He held power for about 14 years before being killed in a rebellion in 23 CE. The textbooks usually wave him away as a usurper and split the Han into western and eastern halves on either side of him, as if the gap weren't there. But it was there. A whole dynasty, founded, ruling, and erased, tucked into a footnote because it spoils the clean line. So deep did the Han identity run that to this day, the majority ethnic group of China, more than 90% of the population, calls itself the Han people. The Chinese script is called Han characters. A 400-year dynasty became the name of a civilization. That is the kind of legacy no terracotta army can match. The Han fell, as they all eventually did, into corruption, court intrigue, and peasant revolt. And what followed was not the next clean dynasty. What followed was nearly 4 centuries of division, the longest fracture yet. If you have ever played a video game or watched a film about ancient China, there is a good chance it was set here. The Three Kingdoms. When the Han collapsed in 220 CE, the empire split into 3 rival states: Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, Wu in the southeast, each ruled by a warlord claiming to be the true heir of the Han. It lasted only about 60 years, but it burned itself into the Chinese imagination so deeply that a novel written more than 1,000 years later, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, remains one of the most read books in the language. Heroes, betrayals, impossible battlefield gambits. History as legend. But the romance hides the misery. The Three Kingdoms gave way to a brief, fragile reunification under a dynasty called the Jin, which promptly fell apart again. And then the north of China, the heartland, the cradle, was overrun by peoples from the steppe. For more than 2.5 centuries, China was cut in two. A patchwork of short-lived, often non-Chinese dynasties ruled the north. A succession of Chinese dynasties ruled the south. Historians lump the whole tangled age under one deliberately vague label: the northern and southern dynasties. This is the part the clean list cannot survive. There is no single dynasty to name. There are a dozen at once, rising and falling, north and south, for nearly 300 years. If you tried to draw the one true ruler of China through this period, your line would snap. And yet beneath the political chaos, something was knitting the country back together. Buddhism, arriving from India along those Silk Road threads, spread across both halves and gave a divided people a shared spiritual language. Northern conquerors gradually adopted Chinese customs, script, and administration, absorbed by the very civilization they had conquered. The pieces were drifting back toward each other, waiting for someone strong enough to force them into one shape again. That someone was the Sui. In 581, a general reunified the north, and by 589 he had conquered the south and put China back together for the first time in almost 3 centuries. The Sui dynasty is short, under 40 years, and it is usually remembered as a brutal failure. But that reputation is unfair, and correcting it tells you something about how dynasties get judged. The Sui's second emperor launched colossal projects. He rebuilt the capital. He extended the Great Wall. And above all, he ordered the digging of the Grand Canal, an artificial waterway over 1,000 miles long, linking the rice-rich south to the political north, knitting the two halves of the reunified country together with water. Millions were conscripted to dig it. Vast numbers died. The projects, plus disastrous military campaigns against Goguryeo in Korea, broke the dynasty's back, and the Sui fell in revolt after barely 2 generations. Here is the thing the list does to the Sui. Because the dynasty was short and ended in collapse, it gets written off as a tyrant's vanity project. But the Grand Canal it built would carry the lifeblood of Chinese economies for the next 1,300 years. Sections of it are still in use today. The Sui did the brutal, unpopular, foundational work. The dynasty that inherited it got the glory. The Tang dynasty, founded in 618, is the one historians reach for when they want to describe China at its most confident. For roughly the first half of its nearly 3-century run, the Tang was arguably the most powerful, most cosmopolitan state on Earth. Its capital, Chang'an, may have been the largest city in the world, a planned grid of walled wards where merchants from Persia, Sogdiana, India, and Japan mingled in the markets. Poetry reached a height never surpassed in the Chinese language. Buddhism flourished. The empire's reach stretched far into Central Asia. And in the middle of this golden age, something happened that had never happened before and would never happen again. A woman took the throne, not as a regent, not as a power behind a puppet, but as emperor in her own right. Wu Zetian rose through the ranks of the palace, outmaneuvered every rival, and in 690 declared herself sovereign. She was the only woman to ever take the title of emperor in Chinese history, and she ruled for about 15 years before being deposed in 705 and the Tang dynasty restored under her son. The Confucian historians who wrote about her afterward despised her and painted her as a monster. Strip away their venom, and what remains is, by most modern assessments, one of the more capable rulers the dynasty ever had. But the Tang's golden age had a fault line running through it, and in 755 the fault line tore open. A frontier general named An Lushan, trusted by the aging emperor, commander of vast armies on the northern border, turned those armies on the throne. The rebellion he launched lasted 8 years and gutted the empire. The emperor fled his own capital in the night. The dynasty survived, technically, for another century and a half, but it never recovered its strength. It limped onward, hollowed out, until warlords finally pulled it apart in 907. There is a number attached to the An Lushan rebellion that you may have heard, and it is the perfect example of how popular history distorts. Census records show China's registered population falling from roughly 53 million before the rebellion to under 17 million after. People sometimes repeat this as the rebellion killed 36 million people, which would make it one of the deadliest events in human history. But most historians read it very differently. What collapsed was not mainly the population. It was the government's ability to count it. When the bureaucracy that registered households broke down, tens of millions of people simply fell off the books. They didn't all die. Many became invisible: refugees, peasants moving south, households quietly dropping out of a tax system that no longer functioned. Real deaths were enormous, certainly in the millions, possibly far more. But the gap between 53 and 17 million is largely a measure of administrative collapse, not a direct body count. The lesson sits at the heart of this whole video. A number from a record is only as trustworthy as the system that produced it. After the Tang shattered in 907, came another fracture, mercifully shorter. Historians call it the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. 5 short-lived dynasties rapidly succeeding one another in the north, while 10 separate kingdoms ruled the south. 50-odd years of division. The list, once again, refuses to be a single line. 5 dynasties in one human lifetime tells you exactly how thin the word can be stretched. Then, in 960, a general was reportedly draped in an imperial robe by his own troops and persuaded to take the throne, founding the Song dynasty and reuniting most of the country. And the Song is where Fairbanks' warning earns its keep, because if you only think in terms of the dynastic cycle, you will completely miss what may be the most transformative period in Chinese history. The Song never matched the Tang's military reach. It was hemmed in by powerful rivals on the steppe: the Khitan Liao, the Tangut Western Xia, and later the Jurchen Jin. 3 serious states that the tidy list often forgets were ruling huge chunks of China at the very same time as the Song. In 1127, the Jin overran the north and captured the Song emperor, forcing the court to flee south. We split the dynasty into Northern Song and Southern Song across that catastrophe. Another break the list smooths over. But militarily, second rate is not the same as backward. Under the Song, China experienced something that looks startlingly like an early industrial and commercial revolution. The first true paper money in the world was issued under the Song, promissory notes called jiaozi that began with merchants in Sichuan and were taken over by the state in the early 11th century. Gunpowder weapons appeared on Song battlefields. The magnetic compass was put to use for navigation. Movable type printing was invented. Cities swelled past 1 million people, fueled by booming trade and new strains of fast-ripening rice. The China of the Song was, by many measures, the most advanced civilization on the planet. A dynasty the cycle theory would file as weaker than the Tang was, in the things that actually move history forward, centuries ahead of the rest of the world. That is exactly the development the wheel of rise and fall is built to make you overlook. The Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his heirs, the Mongol armies built an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary. His grandson, Kublai Khan, finished the conquest of China, extinguished the Southern Song in 1279, and declared himself emperor of a Chinese dynasty he named the Yuan. For the first time, the entire country was ruled by a foreign people from beyond the Great Wall. This breaks the comforting story in a fundamental way. The China of the dynastic list was supposed to be a self-contained civilization handing power down its own bloodlines. The Yuan says otherwise. A steppe empire reached down and took the whole thing, and then, this is the fascinating part, adopted the trappings of a Chinese dynasty, claimed the mandate of heaven, and got written into the list as one of the legitimate links in the chain. The Yuan was relatively short, under a century, and it governed an uneasy, ethnically stratified society where the Mongol conquerors and their foreign allies sat above the Chinese majority. It is the era the Venetian Marco Polo claimed to have visited, dazzling Europe with tales of a wealth it could barely imagine. Whether Polo really made it to China at all is a debate that has never quite been settled, but his book did the work either way. Mongol rule grew brittle. Factional bloodletting at the top, a string of natural disasters, and crushing burdens on the peasantry lit the fuse. In the 1350s, rebellion swept the country. And out of that rebellion rose one of the most remarkable founders in all of Chinese history. A man who began life as a destitute orphan and one-time begging monk, and ended it as emperor. He founded the Ming in 1368 and drove the Mongols back to the steppe. A peasant became the son of heaven. The mandate of heaven, that elegant theory, never had a starker illustration. From nothing to everything, because heaven, the story went, had chosen him. The Ming is the dynasty that built the China many people picture. The Forbidden City in Beijing, that vast walled palace complex, is a Ming creation. And the Great Wall as it exists today, the iconic stone dragon snaking over the mountains that millions of tourists photograph, is overwhelmingly a Ming structure, not the ancient wall of the first emperor. The Ming built the Great Wall we know, rebuilding and extending it in brick and stone to hold back the Mongols they had just expelled. The wall is far younger than its legend. But the most astonishing chapter of the early Ming was written on water, and it ended in deliberate amnesia. In the early 1400s, the Yongle Emperor dispatched a Muslim court eunuch named Zheng He on a series of immense ocean voyages. The scale is hard to overstate. Zheng He's first voyage in 1405 reportedly sailed with 317 ships crewed by some 27,800 men. The largest of them, the Great Beotian, or treasure ships, are described in the sources as exceeding 100 meters in length, though their exact dimensions are still debated by maritime historians. Even the conservative estimates make them the largest wooden ships and largest fleet the world had seen before the Industrial Revolution. These fleets reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa, decades before the first small Portuguese caravels nosed their way around the same continent. And then, China simply stopped. After Zheng He's final voyage in 1433, the Ming abandoned the expeditions. The reasons are still debated. Ruinous expense, the rising threat of the Mongols on the northern frontier pulling money toward the Great Wall, and a deep ideological hostility among the Confucian bureaucrats toward the eunuch faction that ran the voyages. Records of Zheng He's voyages were later destroyed. Tradition says by an official who saw the expeditions as folly that no future emperor should be tempted to repeat, though the precise circumstances of the destruction are murky. China had, for one brief moment, the means to dominate the world's oceans. It chose to turn inward instead. Historians still argue about what that choice cost, and whether choice is even the right word for a decision made by a faction inside a single court. The Ming, like every house before it, eventually decayed. Court paralysis, fiscal crisis, peasant rebellion, and a catastrophic series of famines hollowed it out. In 1644, a rebel army took Beijing. The last Ming emperor hanged himself on a hill behind the palace, and a Ming general, facing the rebels, opened the gates of the Great Wall to a new power waiting in the northeast. The Manchus. Like the Mongols before them, the Manchus were not Han Chinese. They came from beyond the wall, and they founded the Qing, the last imperial dynasty, and in many ways the most successful. The Qing more than doubled the territory of the Ming, pushing the empire's borders to roughly the shape of modern China: Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Taiwan. For its first century and a half, it was prosperous, populous, and powerful. But the Qing had the misfortune of ruling China during the rise of the industrialized West. The 19th century brought the Opium Wars, humiliating defeats, foreign concessions carved out of Chinese cities, devastating internal rebellions, and a slow, grinding loss of sovereignty. The dynasty that had begun by doubling the empire ended unable to defend its own coastline. One internal revolt alone, the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-1800s, killed an estimated 20 million people or more, a death toll comparable to the First World War, and one most people outside China have never heard of. The Qing survived it, barely, and never recovered the strength. And then, in 1912, the wheel stopped. Not because a new dynasty seized the mandate, but because the very idea of the mandate was abolished. A revolution swept away not just the Qing, but the entire imperial system that had governed China since the first emperor. The last emperor, a child named Puyi, abdicated. After more than 2,000 years, there was no longer a son of heaven. The list ends, not with a new family, with the end of families. Start with the most intimate legacy of all: a name. When more than 1 billion people identify as the Han people, they are carrying a 400-year dynasty in their own self-description, 2,000 years after it fell. When the world calls the country China, it is very likely echoing the name of the first emperor's state of Qin, the empire that lasted 15 years and, on the most widely accepted reading, named a civilization for the rest of time. The dynasties did not just rule. They became the words people use to describe who they are. Then there is the machinery of government, which may be the deepest legacy of all. The idea of a centralized state run by a professional, examined, merit-selected bureaucracy, rather than by hereditary nobles, was refined over centuries through the imperial examination system. For more than 1,000 years in theory, a peasant's son who could master the Confucian classics could rise to govern a province. It was never as open as the ideal promised. But the principle that the state should be run by the educated and the tested, not merely the well-born, is one of Imperial China's quiet gifts to the modern world, and versions of it underpin civil services on every continent today. There is infrastructure that still moves people and water. The Grand Canal, that brutal Sui project that helped break the dynasty that dug it, is still in use. The longest artificial waterway on Earth, carrying barges today as it carried grain barges 13 centuries ago. The Great Wall, the Ming's stone answer to the steppe, draws millions of visitors a year to walk a fortification that ultimately failed to keep the Manchus out. The Forbidden City still stands at the heart of Beijing, its halls now a museum holding the largest collection of imperial Chinese artifacts in existence. And there are the inventions that left China and changed everyone: paper, printing, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, the 4 great inventions of the traditional reckoning, and the Song dynasty, that supposedly weak house, sits at the center of 3 of them. Gunpowder would remake European warfare. The compass would guide the very European ships that eventually humbled the Qing. There is a strange, circular justice in that. The tools that helped the West dominate China in the 19th century trace their roots back to Chinese workshops 800 years earlier. But maybe the most important legacy is the one we have been circling this whole time. It is the idea of unity itself. The first emperor's conviction that China was properly one, that division was an aberration to be corrected, and reunification the natural goal, survived every collapse on the list. 3 centuries of fracture after the Han. Another shattering after the Tang. Conquest by Mongols, conquest by Manchus. And every single time the country was put back together because everyone involved believed it was supposed to be together. The dynastic cycle, for all of Fairbank's justified suspicion of it, captured one real and powerful thing: a civilization's stubborn, recurring conviction that no matter how badly it broke, it was always meant to be whole. Which brings us back to the silent city we left in the dirt at the very beginning, the Xia, the unproven first dynasty. Why does it matter so much whether a 4,000-year-old dynasty existed? Because the answer touches the most sensitive nerve in the whole story. The claim that this civilization is the oldest continuous one on Earth, an unbroken thread reaching back to the dawn of the Bronze Age. Some scholars argue the rush to declare Erli II the proof of the Xia reflects a long-standing tendency to confirm the ancient texts rather than test them. Others insist the textual tradition is too detailed and too consistent to dismiss. The dirt at Erli II is real. The bronzes are real. The argument over what to call the people who made them is, in the end, an argument about how far back the story is allowed to begin. And it is still going. We started with a list. A clean column of names marching down the page, each one handing power neatly to the next. By now, you can see what the list hides. The centuries when there was no single China but 2, or 5, or a dozen. The dynasties quietly erased for spoiling the line. Wang Mang's Xin, the steppe kingdoms ruling beside the Song. The short, doomed houses that did the foundational work, and the long, glorious ones that took the credit. The numbers that turned out to measure broken bureaucracies rather than dead bodies. And the very first dynasty of all, still arguing with the archaeologists about whether it gets to exist. The list is not wrong. It is just a story. The story a civilization told itself to make 4,000 years of glorious, violent, creative chaos feel like a single unbroken line. And maybe that act of storytelling is the most Chinese thing on the entire list. The insistence against all the evidence of fracture that it was always one. So here is the question worth sitting with. Chinese scholars largely accept that the city at Erli II was the capital of the Xia, the first dynasty. Many scholars outside China say a city without writing can never prove a named dynasty existed at all. One side is reading the texts forward into the ground. The other is refusing to let the texts decide. Where do you stand? Should the 4,000-year-old records be trusted until disproven? Or should the silence of the dirt have the final word? Make your case below. If walking the long way through these dynasties was worth your time, the channel goes deep on the stories the list flattens. One collapse, one ruler, one strange surviving detail at a time. Stick around for the next one.